The Galactic Council had been in existence for eons, a bastion of order in the vast reaches of space. Comprised of ancient civilizations with advanced technologies and philosophies, it was designed to ensure peace and unity among the countless species scattered across the galaxy. Each member had its place, its voice heard in the deliberations of the Council. But recently, a new voice had begun to rise: humanity's. Humanity, a species still young in the grand scale of galactic history, had begun to stretch its reach beyond Earth, colonizing planets and establishing its presence in star systems far from home. To the Council, the humans were little more than a curiosity at first, a new species brimming with potential but still raw, unrefined. Their technology was crude compared to the sophistication of older species, their military power paltry in comparison to the established galactic powers. But it wasn't their technology or military might that worried the Council. No, it was something far more insidious. It was their culture. On the surface, human culture seemed harmless enough. Their music was simplistic, their art rudimentary, and their literature was little more than stories of war, love, and survival. Yet something about it had begun to infiltrate the minds of other species, slowly at first, but then with a startling speed. It was a force unlike anything the Council had ever witnessed. The first stirrings of concern came when the Xantari, a species known for their sophisticated art and culture, began to incorporate human elements into their own. What had started with small acts of imitation, human songs played on Xantari instruments, human literature translated and reinterpreted, soon turned into full-fledged adoption. The Xantari began to decorate their cities with human-style paintings. Their artists sought inspiration from the simplistic yet vibrant colors of human designs. Their philosophers began to quote human writers. Their political leaders spoke of human ideals of freedom and equality. At first, the Council dismissed it as a passing fad, a brief fascination with an up-and-coming species. But then the Kvort, a militaristic race whose traditions were centuries old, began to adopt human martial arts techniques, blending them with their own combat styles. The Kvort, known for their ruthlessness in battle, were suddenly showing an interest in human concepts of honor and self-discipline. To the Council, this was no trivial matter. The Kvort were a powerful and feared species, and any shift in their ideology could have far-reaching consequences. It wasn't just the Xantari and Kvort. The influence of humanity's culture began to spread like a virus, infecting every corner of the galaxy. Music from Earth found its way into the ears of the Dry, a species whose vocal cords had no resemblance to human physiology, but who now sang in a human style, their voices harmonizing in ways they had never before considered. The Zara, a species of traders and diplomats, began to weave human phrases and idioms into their speech, blending them with their own complex and ancient tongue. Even the serene, meditative Tsar, who had lived in isolation for millennia, found themselves curious about human philosophy, adopting fragments of human thought into their own practices. The Council was alarmed. This was no ordinary exchange of culture. This was something far more dangerous. The humans, in their simplicity, were doing what no other species had managed to do in all their centuries of existence. They were uniting the galaxy. The human desire for connection, their passion for storytelling, their relentless drive for progress. These were not merely traits of a young species, but of a force capable of reshaping the very fabric of the galaxy. And the Council realized with growing horror that this force could not be controlled. Humanity's culture wasn't just being adopted. It was being assimilated, reinterpreted, and integrated into the very core of alien societies. What had begun as admiration was now a subtle but undeniable shift in the cultural balance of power. High above the core worlds, in the heart of the Galactic Council's meeting hall, the leaders of the most influential species gathered. They were a mix of ancient beings, their eyes glinting with wisdom and age. The Kuroks, with their tall, insectoid frames and crystalline exoskeletons, sat across from the Sonorii, a species of energy beings whose bodies fluctuated between forms of pure light. The vast chamber thrummed with the weight of their deliberations. "How long can we ignore this?" said Velk, the elder representative from the Xantari delegation. his voice deep and resonant. "We cannot continue to allow human culture to spread unchecked," argued Vlorn, the leader of the court. "It undermines our identity, our way of life. It will dilute the strength of our traditions and replace them with frivolous notions of equality and personal freedom." "We cannot stop it," said Jar, a Tsar diplomat known for her serenity and wisdom. "The human culture does not fight with weapons. It does not demand tribute. It wins with ideas, with stories, with visions of a future that resonates with every species, whether they realize it or not." The chamber fell silent as the implications of her words settled over the council. "But what does that mean for us?" Velk pressed. "What will be left of our civilizations if we lose our cultural distinctiveness? If every race in the galaxy becomes an echo of humanity?" Jar's eyes flickered as she contemplated the question. "It means we must adapt, just as humanity has. We cannot resist what is inevitable, but we can shape what it becomes." Velk shook his head. "We cannot allow them to reshape us." The debate raged on, but no one could deny the truth of Jar's words. Humanity's influence was not something they could simply stamp out. It was a tide that could not be stopped, a cultural wave sweeping through the galaxy. The real question was whether the Council would allow it to continue, or whether they would attempt to stem the tide and risk the wrath of the fastest-growing force the galaxy had ever seen. And all the while, in the far reaches of space, humanity continued to expand, its influence growing with every passing day, carrying with it the promise of a new era. For the Council, this was no longer just a matter of politics. It was a matter of survival. The question had been asked, and now it was clear: what could stop the unstoppable? As the debate within the Galactic Council continued to escalate, tensions ran high. The Council's halls, once known for their serenity, had become a battleground of ideologies. Velk, the Xantari Elder, and Vlorn, the fierce fort leader, had become vocal champions of resistance, their arguments growing more desperate as humanity's influence spread. On the opposite side, Jar, the Tsar diplomat, remained calm, a steady voice of reason amid the storm, but even she could not escape the weight of the inevitable change. Amidst the chaos, a quiet observer sat in the shadows of the Grand Chamber. Lyra Adams, a human envoy, had been assigned to the Council to represent humanity's interests, though her presence was little more than a courtesy. At least that was the prevailing belief among most of the alien delegates. Humanity's seat at the table was a mere token gesture, a way to acknowledge their growing presence without giving them any real influence. But Lyra understood the delicate balance of power in the galaxy better than anyone, and she knew that humanity's rise would no longer be denied. The galaxy was changing, and the Council had only just begun to understand the scale of it. Her fingers tapped lightly on the smooth surface of the table, the hum of the chamber barely reaching her ears as the voices of the delegates grew louder. She had watched the Council for years, learned its rhythms, its biases. They were not as united as they claimed to be. The factions within it had always been present, lurking just beneath the surface. Now, with humanity's cultural influence spreading like wildfire, those cracks were becoming more apparent. She could feel the unease in the room, the fear of the unknown, the desperation to preserve the old ways. Lyra had been on the front lines of humanity's interaction with the galaxy for years. She had seen the effects of human culture on alien societies firsthand. She had watched as human songs played across alien ships, as human movies became blockbusters in cities light years away from Earth, as alien governments debated adopting human-style democracy. But what she understood, what she had always understood, was that humanity was not a threat. They were a catalyst for something much greater, a fusion of cultures that could lead to unprecedented growth and unity. It was inevitable, and yet, even she couldn't ignore the growing resistance. The Xantari had been the first to embrace humanity's culture, adopting human art and philosophy with startling speed. Velk, the Xantari Elder, was one of the first to recognize the shifting tides. His people had always been known for their refinement, their delicate balance between tradition and innovation. But now, the Xantari were questioning whether they were losing themselves in the flood of human influence. Velk's eyes had hardened, his once diplomatic demeanor replaced with a rare edge of anger. He had spoken often in council meetings of the dangers of cultural assimilation, of the need to protect the purity of ancient practices. And yet, Lyra had seen the cracks in his resolve. Deep down, Velk knew that resisting the inevitable would only lead to greater conflict. Vlorn, on the other hand, had no such reservations. The Kvort were a race of warriors, fiercely proud and bound by a code of honor that had existed for centuries. They had built their entire culture around strength, discipline, and tradition. To them, the spread of humanity's ideas was an existential threat. The human ideals of freedom and equality undermined everything the Kvort stood for. Vlorn had rallied the Kvort against the growing influence, calling for an end to all cultural exchanges with humanity. His rhetoric was fiery, his arguments sharp. He had even gone so far as to propose sanctions on human systems to curb the flow of human media and ideas into Kvort territories. The Kvort were willing to go to war over this, if necessary. But Lyra, in her quiet wisdom, understood the futility of their resistance. Humanity's cultural power was not something that could be stopped with force or decrees. It wasn't like technology, which could be controlled through embargoes or military might. Culture, once it had taken root, was an unstoppable force. It spread in ways no one could predict, seeping into the very fabric of societies. It wasn't just about music or art. It was about ideas, the way humans thought, the way they imagined the future. It was a vision of a world that could be one where cooperation and understanding bridged even the widest of divides. In her mind, Lyra had already seen the future. A future where humanity and the galaxy's diverse species no longer stood in opposition, but worked together. She believed that the blending of cultures would not dilute the identities of each species, but enrich them. Humanity's greatest strength lay in its ability to adapt, to create new forms of expression, to understand and appreciate the cultures of others while still retaining its own essence. If the galaxy was to survive the tides of change, it would need to learn this lesson. But as the Council's debate raged on, Lyra realized that this vision would not be easily accepted. The fear of losing identity was real, and it ran deep. She could see it in the eyes of the delegates, the way they clung to their traditions, as if those traditions were the only thing that defined them. They feared that if they let go, even just a little, they would disappear into the background, swallowed by the tide of humanity's influence. And yet, as the debate reached a boiling point, Lyra stood, her voice steady but resolute. "The question we must ask," she said, cutting through the rising din of arguments, "is not whether humanity's culture will spread. It already has, and it will continue to. The question is whether we will allow it to shape us, or whether we will resist and, in the process, allow fear to shape us instead." The chamber fell silent as all eyes turned to her. For the first time, the weight of her words seemed to land on every delegate present. It was not a threat, but a challenge to embrace the inevitable, to let go of fear, and to evolve. "I understand your concerns," Lyra continued, her voice calm yet firm. "But I ask you to consider this. In a galaxy where so much divides us, perhaps it is time for something to unite us. Not through force, not through power, but through shared vision and understanding." Her words hung in the air, their meaning not yet fully grasped, but already stirring something deep within the hearts of those who heard them. The future, for better or worse, had already begun. The question now was whether the Council could rise above its fear and guide the galaxy toward a new era, one that would be shaped not by resistance, but by the power of a shared culture, shared ideals. The silence in the chamber stretched on, and Lyra knew that the real challenge had only just begun. The silence that followed Lyra's words lingered in the air, thick with unspoken tension. As the delegates exchanged uncertain glances, the tension was palpable. The debate had shifted. What had begun as a discussion of human influence had now become something more, something personal. It was no longer just about culture or politics. It was about identity, survival, and the fear of being erased. Velk's eyes, normally so steady, now flickered with uncertainty. For all his pride in the Xantari's heritage, for all his belief in the preservation of tradition, there was a gnawing doubt creeping into his mind. Was it possible that humanity's vision of a united galaxy wasn't just an illusion? Was it possible that the cultures of the galaxy didn't have to be mutually exclusive, that a new order, one shaped by cooperation and understanding, could truly work? He had always believed that his people's cultural richness, honed over millennia, was irreplaceable. But now, as Lyra stood before the council, her calm words cutting through his resolve like a blade, he began to question everything. He had seen the way the Xantari embraced human art, how they eagerly adapted it to their own sophisticated tastes. There was beauty in it, yes, but at what cost? The same could be said of every species, from the Kvort to the Dry, whose obsession with human media seemed to deepen by the day. He had been vocal in the council against this shift, but now he couldn't escape the feeling that he was fighting a losing battle. Vlorn, the Kvort leader, had been quiet for longer than usual. His face, stern and unyielding, showed no trace of the doubt that had begun to emerge in Velk. But Vlorn's mind was equally torn, though in a different way. The Kvort, who had once prided themselves on their battle prowess and rigid social structure, were now being swept up by humanity's ideals. The Kvort warriors, who had learned their martial arts in blood-soaked arenas, were now incorporating human techniques into their own fighting styles. And it wasn't just the warriors. The political structures were changing too. Some of the younger Kvort leaders began to speak of the virtues of democracy, a concept entirely alien to their warrior-based hierarchy. Vlorn had never entertained such thoughts. He had always viewed his people's way of life as sacrosanct. But now, the constant infusion of human ideals, freedom, self-determination, equality, was shaking that foundation. His own soldiers, once the epitome of discipline and loyalty, were questioning their leadership. They had begun asking whether their honor was still valid, whether their ancient ways were truly the best path forward. The human culture was not just a virus. It was a mirror. It reflected back the deepest fears and desires of each species, forcing them to confront their own shortcomings, their own flaws. The Kvort had always prided themselves on strength, but now they were being asked to reconsider what true strength meant. Was it brute force, or was it the ability to adapt, to evolve? Vlorn could not deny the question, but he was unwilling to show weakness, unwilling to accept the transformation that humanity demanded. Meanwhile, Lyra watched the council's inner struggle with a quiet resolve. She had known this would happen. She had known that humanity's cultural power wasn't just about art or music. It was about the ability to reshape minds, to shift the very way people thought about themselves and their place in the galaxy. She knew, too, that it wasn't a power that could be wielded lightly. It was a force for unity, yes, but it also carried with it the potential for upheaval. She had come to the council to represent humanity, but she understood that her role wasn't just to advocate for Earth's interests. It was to advocate for a new vision, one that transcended the boundaries of species, one that saw the galaxy not as a collection of isolated empires, but as a collective whole. A vision where each species could maintain its unique identity while contributing to a greater, shared culture. But she had not anticipated the ferocity of the resistance. "The fear I see here," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs that had begun to swell around her, "is not of what humanity will do. It's of what you are afraid of yourselves. The fear that you will lose something essential, something that defines you. But let me ask you this. If you lose your traditions to humanity's culture, what does that say about the strength of your identity?" Her gaze swept over the assembled delegates, and for the first time, she saw uncertainty flicker in their eyes. It was as if her words had touched something deep within them, something they had never been willing to acknowledge. They feared losing themselves, yes, but more than that, they feared that their culture was fragile, that it could be so easily replaced by something else. The truth, Lyra knew, was that the galaxy's cultures were already changing. The spread of human culture wasn't an invasive force. It was simply part of the natural evolution of civilizations. It was up to the Council, and to each species, to decide how they would adapt. Velk shifted in his seat, his mind working furiously. He could feel the weight of his position, the responsibility he carried as the representative of his people. The Xantari had always been a civilization defined by refinement and subtlety, but now their cultural landscape was being flooded with new influences. For a moment, Velk wondered if the Xantari's fear of assimilation had less to do with the human culture itself and more to do with their own reluctance to change. Could the Xantari evolve? Or would they remain stagnant, clinging to traditions that no longer served them? For Vlorn, the question was more immediate. The Kvort were a warrior race, but their warriors had begun to question their purpose. Human ideals of freedom and self-expression had infiltrated even the most hardened hearts. And the warriors, always so loyal to their leaders, now looked to the stars and wondered, was there another way? Was there more to strength than simply conquering? The council chamber was quiet for a moment, the only sound the faint hum of energy fields that protected the structure. Lyra's words had left their mark, but the delegates still had to come to terms with the enormity of the choice before them. Would they continue to resist the inevitable, or would they accept that the galaxy's cultural landscape was shifting in ways they could not control? In the silence, Velk finally spoke, his voice low but steady. Perhaps there is room for both. For our traditions, and for the new ideas that are coming to us. Lyra's heart gave a quiet leap. It was a crack in the wall, a sign that perhaps, just perhaps, the galaxy was ready to embrace the change. But she knew this was only the beginning. The real challenge would come when the Council had to make its decision. Would they find a way to integrate humanity's culture into their own? Or would they resist until the fractures in the galaxy were too deep to mend? The next few days would be critical. The Council chamber was unusually quiet. The debates had paused for a rare moment of reflection, as each delegate seemed to weigh the gravity of the situation in their minds. The idea of cultural assimilation, of blending ancient traditions with the ever-expanding influence of humanity, was one that none of them had ever anticipated. Lyra sat in her seat, her fingers interlaced before her, her gaze steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. The decision would be made soon, and she knew it would shape the galaxy for centuries to come. Velk sat across the table, his eyes scanning the room. The Xantari elder had once been a staunch defender of tradition, but now he found himself caught between two worlds. The discussions within the Xantari delegation had been long and heated. Many of his people wanted to resist the tide of human influence, to fortify their cultural boundaries and preserve what had taken millennia to create. But there were others, voices that had been growing louder, who believed that perhaps humanity's ideas could offer something valuable, something that could take their society to new heights. Velk had never been one to waver, yet now, with the future of the Xantari at stake, he was torn. Humanity's cultural presence was like a growing wave, rising higher with each passing moment. He had seen the changes in his own people, how human art, music, and philosophy had seeped into the deepest corners of Xantari society. It was a subtle influence, at first something they could ignore, but now it had become impossible to overlook. Their scholars quoted human philosophers. Their artists painted in bold, vibrant strokes that had once been foreign to them. And there was a certain unease in Velk's heart as he realized that these changes were not necessarily bad. They were transformative, even beautiful. But that beauty came at a cost. The Xantari had always prided themselves on their intellectual depth, their emphasis on subtlety, and their intricate understanding of the universe. Human culture, though full of vitality, was brash, immediate, and raw. Could it truly coexist with the ancient ways of the Xantari, or would it eventually consume them? And yet, could they afford to be left behind, to shut themselves off from the rest of the galaxy? Vlorn, the Kvort leader, was even more resolute in his opposition. The Kvort had no use for what they considered the frivolities of human culture. Their existence had been built on strength, on the unyielding will to survive and dominate. They valued honor, sacrifice, and the pursuit of martial excellence, qualities they believed would be diluted by the spread of human ideals. The notion of freedom, of democracy, had no place in the Kvort world. It was weakness, an idea that threatened to destabilize their entire way of life. For Vlorn, the growing influence of humanity's ideas was a threat. one that he could not allow to take root within his people. He had heard the whispers among his soldiers, the young court warriors who were beginning to question the traditions that had defined their existence. They spoke of human concepts like equality and justice, ideas that had no foundation in court society. It unsettled him, made him feel as though the very core of his people's identity was under siege. But beneath the anger, beneath the defiance, Vlorn's mind churned with something he had not allowed himself to acknowledge before: doubt. The court had always been a war-driven species, their purpose defined by conquest. But in recent years, they had faced new challenges: economic instability, a loss of resources, and, most troubling of all, the decline in their warrior caste. The court were a society in decline, and though they would never admit it openly, they needed something to change. Could humanity offer that change? Was it possible that the ideals of freedom, of individuality, could help the court rise from their stagnation? The questions haunted him, and he found himself questioning the path he had set for his people. His duty was to protect the court, to maintain their strength. But now, as Lyra's challenge echoed in his mind, he was unsure whether his people's strength lay in isolation or in adaptation. Lyra herself had been waiting for this moment for weeks. The quiet before the storm. The council's decision would come soon, and with it, the fate of humanity's place in the galaxy. She knew the stakes were high. For her people, it wasn't just about preserving their culture. It was about creating a future in which humanity's vision could lead to a new order, one where the boundaries between species were not rigid and unyielding, but fluid and cooperative. She understood the resistance. She understood the fear that came with change. To some, humanity's cultural influence represented the collapse of everything they had worked for, a tide that threatened to swallow their identities. But to others like Lyra, it was an opportunity for growth, for unity, for the exchange of ideas that could benefit everyone. The question was whether the galaxy would embrace it, or whether fear would push them into a war of resistance. As the council session drew to a close, the final decision was at hand. Lyra stood, her posture tall and confident, but her heart raced. She had fought for this moment, but she knew the outcome was far from certain. The delegates had been torn, and though she had planted the seeds of doubt in their minds, she could not predict what they would choose. Velk was the first to speak. His voice, once full of certainty, now held a note of caution. "We have listened. We have heard the arguments on both sides. I cannot deny that humanity has shown us a new way forward. We cannot close ourselves off to that." The room shifted, an audible murmur of surprise. The Xantari had always been staunch in their defense of tradition, and yet Velk had spoken in favor of change. He had crossed a line that many of his people would not have dared. The moment hung in the balance. Vlorn, however, was not so quick to bend. "And what of the court?" he said, his voice grating with defiance. "What of those who have lived and died by the strength of their culture? Will we abandon everything for the sake of ideas that we cannot comprehend?" Lyra's heart clenched. She had known this would happen. The court were far from ready to embrace the shift that humanity represented. But there was something in Vlorn's voice, something more than the anger. There was a flicker of uncertainty, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. As the room fell silent, Lyra's mind raced. The council had reached a crossroads, one that would define the future of the galaxy. Would they reject humanity's influence and risk conflict, or would they open their minds to something new, something transformative? The question loomed, and for the first time, Lyra wasn't sure which way the galaxy would turn. But she knew this. The tides of history were moving, and no matter what decision the council made, humanity's cultural wave could not be stopped. It would sweep across the galaxy, changing everything in its path. The only question was whether the galaxy would choose to ride the wave, or be swept away by it.